Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. At a moment during The One Who Wrote Destiny, Neha, one of our four narrators, reflects about her family. My ba believed in destiny, my father believes in coincidence, I believe in patterns and consistency, and my brother believes in the manifest destiny of his own male ego. Destiny, manifest or otherwise, coincidence, patterns and consistency, the forces that shape a life are very much at the forefront of this dazzling family saga, whether they be structural inequalities or the ticking time bomb of genetic disease. As readers, we get to interrogate these questions from four different perspectives and across three different epochs. Firstly, alongside Mukesh Jani in 1966, a recent immigrant to Yorkshire from Kenya, struggling with the physical and emotional separation from his family, not to mention the overt, often violent racism of England at the time. Later, we accompany Mukesh's children, the twins Neha and Rax, as they deal with the legacy of their father's choices and their mother's genes, and attempt to navigate a society into which they were born, and yet which still sees them as other. A society often ruled, as Neha observes, by mediocre, straight white people. Our final voice is a figure from Mukesh, Rax and Neha's past, who may hold the key to help them understand where they've come from and where their lives might be headed. It's a testament to Nikesh Shukla's skill as a novelist that a book of such scope and such tonal range, a book that hops from Yorkshire to London to New York to Kenya and from the 1960s to the present day, not only doesn't collapse under the weight of its own ambition, but keeps the reader engaged and entertained throughout. Nikesh Shukla pulls it off not only thanks to his ability to craft convincing, empathetic characters, but also with his impressive flair for comedy. As stand-up Nish Kumar said, The One Who Wrote Destiny is very funny, but packs a hell of an emotional punch. In addition to The One Who Wrote Destiny, Nikesh Shukla is the author of the novels Coconut Unlimited and Meat Space. Coconut Unlimited was shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award and longlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize, while The Guardian compared Meat Space to Douglas Copeland's Generation X, declaring this novel captures a cultural moment. In 2016, Nikesh Shukla was the driving force behind the smash hit essay collection The Good Immigrant, where 21 British writers of colour discuss race and immigration in the UK. The Good Immigrant won the Reader's Choice at the Books Are My Bag Awards and was shortlisted for the Book of the Year at the British Book Awards. His first book for teenagers, Run Riot, will be released in June 2018. The Guardian lavished praise on The One Who Wrote Destiny, declaring it funny and profound, while the Financial Times called it defiant, adding it was an intelligent, devastating and gorgeously entertaining novel that expresses its anger with just the right level of fun. Please join me in welcoming Nikesh Shukla to Shakespeare and Company.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey. Hello, everyone. This is like a weird writer's dream come true, to be sitting in Shakespeare and Company talking about your own work instead of fantasising about sitting in Shakespeare and Company talking about your own work. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's really amazing.
Well, thank you for joining us, although we do make you work for your dream. And I think the first thing we're going to have a little extract from the beginning. So you have the lectern next to you. You have a copy of this wonderful book.
Okay, microphone check. Okay, so I'm going to read from the. I'm going to do a couple of extracts over the course of the evening, but I'm going to start with the opening of the novel, which starts in 1966 in Keighley, which is in Yorkshire, featuring a guy called Mukesh who has just arrived in England. Thinking that he is not far from London. Keighley is 222 miles from London, but it was hard in the 60s to find lodgings that would accept coloured folk, and I can say coloured folk because I'm a coloured folk. Just so we're clear about the racial slur, coloured. Okay. I have no reason to be anywhere. I find myself in an in-between world with no purpose, except to lean with my back against the wall, across the road from Nisha's Ummi and Papa's house. Not like a stalker. No, instead I am posed like the poet I am, my pen poised to make ink marks and etchings on an open notebook page. So far all I have written is Nisha's name. Her first name, her full name, her first name with my surname, my first name with her surname, our names together. I write the openings of poems, but I never get past the first word of the first line. I have never written a poem before. I know that the first line starts with the word Nisha. Despite my lack of experience as a writer, her very existence inspires me, convinces me I was born to tell stories. Nisha means night. Maybe there is something in this for me to spin into poetry. Nisha, tonight, you are night. I wear my best clothes because they're all I have that isn't my white pyjama lenga or my exercise shorts. And now I'm no longer in school, I don't need to subject myself to the level of humiliation that comes with wearing short shorts. The damp breeze reminds me that I am alone in England, in a navy blue suit that used to belong to my father, which I cannot button up. Ummi tried to find me blue trousers that matched it, but failed. In the grey of Keighley, the difference between the two is extremely noticeable. I have 2 white shirts which, due to the climate, I can wear all day every day, as there is never any chance of getting hot enough to stain the collar. I look down at my father's black tie, thin with a pin that bears his name in Gujarati, Rakesh. I wonder what has happened to my wardrobe now that I'm here. Ummi has probably given everything to my younger brother, because why take clothes invented for hotter climates to the wet and grey of England's green and pleasant land? Nisha, are you my destiny? I glance at my watch again, my father's watch. Everything I own is my father's. I have to preserve these heirlooms to pass on to my younger brother. Until then, I am the head of the family and thus inherit all of his fancy items. The watch says 5:30 p.m. on the nose. The British have funny expressions for things. 5:30 p.m. on the nose. Everything has a nose, it seems. Everything has human features and expressions and human responses. They didn't teach me this in school. I learnt about verb conjugations, about vocabulary, pronouns, adjectives, adverbs. I was never taught vernacular, slang. The entire English language is composed of idioms. I feel lost most days when overhearing conversations at breakfast between the owners of the house where I lodge. I never say anything. They assume it's because I speak no English. Actually, it's because I do not speak their version of English.
Thank you. I think it's funny, in that quite short extract we get sort of 2 perspectives on destiny from the same mind, in fact. So you have the very first line, I have no reason to be anywhere, which is, it made me think of the review from the Financial Times where they called it a defiant book, and it does seem like a defiant sort of opening. And yet at the same time, when he's there and he's looking across to where the woman he's fallen in love with is, he wonders if she is his destiny, and that seems to be the sort of the central conflict for many of the characters in the book. In fact, is how much destiny, how much fate has an effect on our life. And I was just wondering, would you be able to talk a little bit about how you came to sort of be interested in this concept of destiny?
Yeah, well, firstly, the first line, I have no reason to be anywhere, is my sort of comment on the immigration debate in a strange way, because I think the narrative around immigration in the UK is toxic, and I wanted this book to be a book about immigrants, and I purposely wanted to steer away from writing about refugees or asylum seekers. I wanted to write about people who made the move for reasons around family or jobs or money or opportunity, and I wanted to kind of comment on the fact that often there isn't any rhyme or reason for these things. So I have no reason to be anywhere. I could be here, I could be in Kenya, I could be in London, but I ended up in Keighley because of not being, the sort of the coincidence of not being able to find lodgings that would accept coloured people, which is, the thing that unfolds later on in his story. But in terms of the idea of destiny, it's always been really, really fascinating for me, because my mother died in 2010, and it was quite a shock. And my mother and father were both, they both had very conflicting views on how our lives play out. Both of them would in the same breath talk about how everything was written, and how you had to write your own destiny, which to me kind of seemed to be two things that were at odds with each other. And so they were pragmatists, but they were also Hindu. So they believed that all of this was pre-written, and they believed in reincarnation. But they also believed that hard work would take you to where you needed to be, and not your destiny. And I've been thinking about those things for a long time, in terms of I guess my family's place in the world. My mum dying quite suddenly was quite a big wake-up call for my dad, in terms of his feelings around destiny and all the rest of it. And I kind of wanted to look at how things like our cultural heritage and our attitudes towards our racial identity, our cultural identity, how there are some really, really fundamental generational differences between the two. There's a dynamic in the book that kind of really interrogates my relationship with my dad, where I went to a predominantly white school, and I would come home and I'd go, "Oh Dad, this guy said this to me, and this guy said my skin must taste like shit," and my dad would go, "What are you talking about? This is Mickey Mouse racism. It's just words. It doesn't mean anything." My dad nearly died in the mid-60s. He was waiting for a bus, and he was attacked by some men who one of them bottled him in the head, and he nearly bled to death. And he was like, "That's racism. What you're going through, that's just words. Just get your head down, work hard." He repeated to me the immigrant motto: you have to work twice as hard to have half the opportunities of the average white man. And so I wanted to kind of talk about that generational divide that we had, and how weirdly things like Brexit kind of brought us to an understanding.
And there's definitely, I guess, the added layer with the concept of destiny as well. When you do come from a background in which there are sort of social structures that would sort of impede progress in a society. Like it's very easy if you coast through life to success because there are no barriers in front of you, to talk about destiny and to sort of see it as everything being written. But it's sort of, I think the question about whether things are predestined is much harder to accept, or is much harder to come down on the positive when everything feels like a battle, and it feels like there's lots of unfairness connected to your life.
Yeah, like I didn't want to shy away from sort of the really, really hard things that people go through when they move from one place to another, and the society they move to almost isn't prepared for them. We had, I don't know how many of you guys are from the UK, but we had this kind of weird thing where in the 80s the conversation was around integration, integrate, and in the 90s the conversation was around how we all lived in a multicultural melting pot of steel bands and samosas, and we're kind of in the UK at the moment living I always thought that steel bands and samosas and saris thing, a way of describing multiculturalism, was really sort of really surface and kind of inane, and it feels like what's happening in the UK at the moment with the rise of the far right and the shifting of like the Overton window all the way over to the right, where you have people like Nigel Farage on our TV more than you have actual elected politicians, that we're kind of living in the aftermath of that pretense that we had achieved full integrated multiculturalism in the mid-90s. It was a lie. It wasn't a lie. I think it was just completely misunderstood what a multicultural society looked like. So my dad bought into the conservative myth that work hard and you will have access to all of the opportunities that comes with working hard, because that conservative myth comes from this idea that we live in a meritocratic society where everyone has equal access and opportunity to things. And I grew up in the steel bands and samosas era, when I was like, oh man, let's all just wear bindis to Glastonbury and it'll all be fine. Let's all listen to Corner Shop and, you know, live that myth. But it was all bullshit.
That's one of the things why I think it's particularly interesting about the book, is that because you deal with I guess 3 generations in a way, but specifically I'm thinking about the generational gap between Mukesh and his children. I mean, you already mentioned something which actually comes up in the book, where Mukesh is talking to his daughter, and he says, you know, you measure what you call microaggressions against a real fear, like a real fear of sort of being physically attacked and being physically harmed, fearing he's going to die. And yet at the same time, one thing we get from reading the sections for Neha and for Rax is that this might be, I don't know whether you should say it's different in scale or different in kind, but it doesn't in fact diminish the experiences of racial prejudice that Neha and Rax experience. But what I'm trying to say is you put you show 2 different types of experience of racial prejudice over 2 different generations, and show that both can be sort of equally harmful, despite the fact that perhaps the threat of immediate physical violence isn't there so much.
Yeah, definitely. I really wanted to convey the sort of that tension that me and my dad had, that there is a scale to all these things that happen, and different generations go through different things at different times, but it was perfectly illustrated for me when I was I had a breakthrough with this book when I was editing it last year, because a thing happened in the UK courts that kind of fundamentally showed me how far we had not come. So in 1968 in the UK, the Race Relations Act comes in, which basically is there to kind of target racial discrimination, that commonplace racial discrimination that's happening in society, that's stopping people having access to public services and housing and all the rest of it. In 1968, my uncle, who ended up in Keighley and then moved to Huddersfield to work as a broadcast engineer for a TV channel, because it was like a good vocational job that he could find. So he tries to buy a house in Huddersfield in 1968, so he can he's like the first person in our family who is able to buy a house, and classic Asian style, he's going to move our entire family into that one house. So he takes my Bapoji and all his brothers and sisters to this housing estate that's being built, and they look at the show home, and they go home, and he phones up the company and says, I'd like to make an offer to buy one of the houses on this estate. And the person on the other end of the phone says, are you from the coloured family that came to look at the house? And he says, yes. She says, oh, sorry, we have a company policy, we don't sell houses to coloured people, we want to maintain the integrity of the area. And my uncle says, did you know that this just became illegal? And my uncle took them to court. My uncle is the first person in the UK to bring a case of racial discrimination, which he did in 1968, which he did at a huge cost to himself. To his company didn't want him to do it because they didn't want to be associated with any negative press. Friends of his were like, this is going to be really bad for you, but he stood up for what he believed in, and he took this company to court. And because it was the first case, there were some technical issues to do with how the case was brought to court, which meant that the case had to be dismissed. But in his judgment, the judge said, while we are dismissing this case, it is clear that discrimination has taken place. And the company, off the back of that, changed their policy, which is really, really amazing. So that happened in 1968. In 2017, last year, a guy gets taken to court He's a landlord in Kent. He has lots of properties that he rents out, and he refuses to rent out properties to South Asians because they stink the place up with curry smells. In 2017, and you look at that, and I spoke to my uncle about it, and my uncle was like, "This is the type of stuff they were saying to us in the 60s. This is the type of stuff when everyone refused to call me by my name and they just call me Tom at my company. We're not supposed to be here." And so that thing of like how far we've come and how far we haven't come, that was the thing that I really wanted to interrogate in the book, because I think the generations in the book reach this point where they can't come to an understanding that what the father has gone through to make life comfortable for his kids has afforded them a lot more opportunities and given them the space to do whatever they want. But it's not because society changed, it's because he made sacrifices for them. And I think ultimately that is the intergenerational conversation that a lot of us are having with our parents, is like, my dad nearly died so I could be a writer and sit in front of you. He was desperate for me to become a lawyer, but he was also desperate for me to see what opportunities, and he sent me to a school that basically made me think I could do whatever I wanted. And what I do, the irony is, what I do now is like I stand up like my uncle and I talk about all these things, either through like doing work like The Good Immigrant and then going into schools and talking about race, or like putting it in the fiction, because it's important, and it's important for us to also measure how far we haven't come.
Do you think, because I was wondering this, and it's interesting that you mentioned sort of the period of growing up in the 90s in Britain, where there was this sort of, at least sort of surface celebration of multiculturalism. My impression is, and this is as someone who's lived out of Britain now for quite a while, but that there has been a regression. Do you think that, for example, when you talk about like 1968 and then 2017, 2018, do you think it was sort of between 1968 there were some sort of improvements and it has regressed, or do you think the improvements were sort of superficial and there was kind of always this kind of sort of deep running racism which never really got treated?
Oh, it's hard to say, because I would probably get into a lot of trouble for saying that Britain is an institutionally racist country, but I think it is. You just have to look at how we all came to be in Britain through the aftermath of colonialism, which is something that we just don't talk about. There was a survey in the Telegraph like a couple of years ago where like 44% of the country think that the colonialism was like benevolent towards the nations it oppressed, and there was this like Bristol kid like a couple of weeks ago for his like 19th birthday in Bristol. He threw this colonial chic party where everyone had to come dressed as like subjects of the Maharaja and celebrate the days that Britain and India lived side by side during the Raj. That boy has not read his history books. We didn't live side by side with the British. We were oppressed by them. The British Raj was not a Maharaja from Indian descent. Like, so that lack of conversation around colonialism, I think, feeds into this. I've gone into a rant, so I've actually forgotten the question that you asked that led me down this little cul-de-sac of anger. But
whether there was progress and regression, or whether the progress was just sort of superficial.
Yeah, there has been progress, but I think the progress shows like the precarious nature of being from an immigrant community. I guess, because I talk a lot about, representation in popular culture, because I think that is important for society to see those representations in popular culture, because that's where so many of us begin thinking about who we can be as people when we grow up, or like who our role models are, or who we can aspire to be. If you can see it, you can be it, and all that kind of stuff. And that's why I think children's programs and children's books and books for teenagers is so important, for them to be diverse, not just for people like me, like people of color, but for white people as well. White people need to see positive representations of women of color being just as kick-ass as Tony Stark or what have you, because then white people could, there was this brilliantly weird thing that happened when they announced the new Doctor Who was going to be a woman, and one of the old Doctor Who's, Peter Davidson, said, well, it's a shame that boys are going to lose one of their role models. And I just thought, she can still be a role model for boys. Also, boys have got quite a lot of role models. But going back to this sort of precarious nature of, like, being a person of colour in the West, it's like, yes, progress has been made, and then you have one big failure and then things regress, or people think that political correctness has gone mad, and so you read a lot about the anxieties of the white working class in, like, the New York Times and in, like, various newspapers in the UK, like, you can't have working class black people, or like, you can't have working class brown people, and this sort of and it's because that you have, I guess I'm using TV as an example, you have decades and decades and decades of representation of middle class white people on British TV, and then you have, like, a bunch of middle class brown and black people, and then the white working class suddenly feels underrepresented. But actually, it's still showing like, people of colour through a certain lens. It's not necessarily, amazingly, we're not all some homogenous group. And even the term people of colour sort of lumps everyone out into, like, the same thing. In the UK we're called BAME. In the 80s we were all black according to, like, colloquialism, and then we became ethnic minorities, and then we became minority ethnic, and then we became black and minority ethnic, and then we became black, Asian and minority ethnic, which is where we are now. And Kamala Shamsi said once, it just takes one Latino and then we become blame, which I thought was really funny.
On that subject of representation in popular culture, of course, the character of Rax, so he's a stand-up comedian, and I think it just seemed to be a very interesting and a very sort of pertinent choice of career, particularly considering what the sort of the debate that's been going on in the UK over the last few years about sort of about representation generally, and on, I guess, comedy panel shows in particular. And this is something like one of the most, I guess, kind of acerbically satirical chapters in The One Who Wrote Destiny is taking some of the sort of the attitudes of these TV producers to task. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision to make Rax a stand-up comedian, and particularly to bring this situation to light.
Yeah, so I'll come. That's got a longer answer, but there's one chapter in the book where Rax, to his friends, is invited onto a panel show, and like topical comedy news show, and they're all quite scripted, these news shows, and he is part of his script involves him telling a racist joke which he feels is racist, and just because it's said through his mouth, he feels uncomfortable with it, so he's really wrestling with the producer about whether he wants to do this or not. And I'm friends with a lot of stand-up comedians, and a bunch of them read it, and a bunch of them said, did I tell you that story? And I was like, no, did that actually happen? And they were like, no, but I really had to think about it, and it feels like it could happen, that you will just be in a situation where, like, some comedy writers like, this is funny, we'll get the brown guy to say it, and then it doesn't seem racist, it seems funny, but it's still not come from a good place. But Rakesh, I made a stand-up comedian because I'm kind of obsessed with the mindset of stand-up comedians. I don't know how anyone would be or could be a stand-up comedian, and some really close friends of mine do stand-up, but there's something so Steve Allen once said that time plus tragedy equals comedy. And so you have comedians going on stage night after night, trying to make people laugh from a position of their own personal pain, and that comedians expect laughter. Like if you read my book, I could expect, well, I'd hope, a multitude of reactions. You might find it funny or sad or boring or tedious or the best genius, or I'm trying to put...
I'm worried you've given us 2 good adjectives and about 5 negative ones.
Or you know, you can have a variety of reactions, but you know, a stand-up comedian, everything is in the moment of the telling of the joke, and if you don't laugh, then it hasn't gone right. And if you don't laugh at how they have converted their pain into something funny, you know, that's got to mess with them. So I'm really fascinated by the life of the stand-up comedian. I feel like it's more there's more solitude in being a stand-up comedian than being a writer, because you're a sole performer on stage, just you and a microphone, trying to make people laugh, and then after the show you're trying to make people laugh, or you're trying to make comedians laugh, and then you're in a car home or you're on the train home by yourself and kind of processing whether that joke landed. Why didn't it land? Was it me or was it the crowd? And so that idea of a stand-up comedian, to me, where Rax is in the book, it kind of felt like the right choice for him to make him a stand-up comedian, because I wanted to. I already mentioned that my mum died when in 2010. So the week that my mum died was the same week that my first novel came out, and it was a really strange time. It was a horrible time, but also this thing that I'd wanted, like, my entire life had happened, and I was pulled in 2 very separate directions. And I really remember on the day of my mum's funeral, there just happened to be a 2-page interview with me in a big national newspaper, and people were texting me on the day saying, "Oh, I just saw the interview, well done." And I'm on my way to my mum's funeral, and for some reason I don't turn my phone off. There's something comforting about people saying, "Oh, that was, I read your interview, well done, man." And so Rax is grieving for someone in the book, and he's grieving very privately, and he's performing very publicly because his career is in its ascendance. And I wanted to use that to kind of try and understand why I didn't turn my phone off that day. I mean, for me, that is what fiction does. Fiction allows me the space to interrogate things that I don't understand, either about the world or about myself, and so that for me was like a really useful way of trying to process the weeks after my mum died in a weird way.
There's also, I guess, the thing with stand-up comedy as well is that it's an incredibly confrontational arena, and often the comedians will face the kind of the worst of the audience. If the audience aren't enjoying it, they're not finding it funny, then the heckling can start and the insults can fly. And that's I wondered also if a potential sort of inspiration for Rax might have been some of the work you've been doing, your advocacy work, your work with the Good Immigrant. I know you've done a lot of panels, a lot of public events, and I know it's a different arena. It's not like you going out there trying to make the people laugh, trying to elicit a particular reaction. But I did wonder when reading it if some of the kind of hostility that Rakesh experiences from the crowd, like whether that experience was in some way transposed from some of your advocacy work.
Yes and no. So there's one chapter in Rax's section where his dad goes up to Edinburgh to visit him while he's doing his Edinburgh run, and a thing happens which I won't spoil for you because you're all going to buy the book, right? I have to do the hard sell at some point, right?
Don't worry, I've got your back for later.
Okay, thank you. And so I've lost my train of thought doing the hard sell. His dad and a thing happens, and that there's a lot of hostility from the crowds, and that chapter was actually quite a late addition to the book. Something else was happening there, and it just wasn't working. I just couldn't make the thing that I was trying to do work, and so my friend is a guy called Nish Kumar. He was in the Good Immigrant, and he hosts this show called The MASH Report, and his Edinburgh show 2 or 3 years ago, when was Brexit? that old thing, 2016. 2016. So he was on stage like the day after or a couple of days after Brexit, and he was performing, and someone just stood up and said, "Go home." And that inspired his Edinburgh show that year. And his Edinburgh show that year was very much about what had kind of happened to him in the aftermath of Brexit. And for me as a novelist, I was like, that's kind of interesting. I shall take that. And because you know, when you do book events, you don't usually get people. Well, I have yet had someone shout at me to go home during a book event. Usually you know trouble is coming when someone says, it's less of a question and more of a comment, really. And then you're like, oh god. Is the comment, I think it's time you should go home. And we've definitely had some sticky situations where you know, we were talking about this earlier, like where people have basically accused me of being racist, but in an intellectual way, because it's a book event, just because I talk about race a lot and racism, or I have done in the last few years. And yeah, so I guess bits of that did go into those sections with Rax. But I mean, there is like a bigger thing that I'm trying to understand as well, which is like the sort of the comedy of offence and like what comedy should do and what satire should do. Because I think for me, like, you know, so many comedians want to die on the hill of I want the right to tell offensive jokes because funny is funny, and I always think, but who's laughing? Mm-hmm. Is the joke funny, and who is it funny to? I really remember an interview with Jerry Seinfeld where he was talking about the lack of black comedians on his show, and like the lack of diversity on Seinfeld, which, you know, I love. It's a hilarious show. It's a mean show, but it's a hilarious show. But there's not a lot of black people in it, and like the one Indian character is a horrific stereotype. And he said, I don't care who you are, black, white, whatever, funny is funny. And I just thought that was a really lazy statement to make, because funny isn't funny. Like, funny is funny to who? Who is making the joke? Who is the gatekeeper of what is funny? And so these ideas of like, you know, how telling an offensive joke is actually a free speech issue, for me, kind of doesn't actually answer the question who is laughing. It instead tries to obfuscate what is like and Lindy West summed up brilliantly. She was put on this like TV panel debate thing with this comedian called Jim Norton, who was defending his right to tell rape jokes, and she said, and he was talking about it being a free speech issue, and she said, well, if you want it to be a free speech issue and you want the freedom of speech to tell rape jokes, then I have the freedom of speech to call you a dickhead if I want to. And I think that's a perfect way of putting it. Like, if people want the freedom of speech to tell offensive jokes, then I have the freedom of speech to criticize that joke, and then like either have a conversation with them about why I think it's offensive or not funny, or call them a dickhead, because like that's just as offensive as your offensive rape joke. It's an odd kind of paradox, I guess, in a way, isn't it, that like what you said earlier, like so much of the stand-up's art is eliciting a reaction from people, and yet when you come out with something like funny is funny, it sort of implies a kind of objective kind of humour divorced from the people laughing. It's the same as literary merit. When people talk about literary merit, I think that I call bullshit on literary merit as well. I don't think it exists. Literary merit is subjective. Like, you know, when editors reject books because they didn't see the literary merit in it, I just think it's bullshit. It doesn't mean anything. It means I did not like this as an editor, and it did not do anything for my tastes. You know, funny is subjective. Literary merit is, like, what is literary is subjective. And these blockers are kind of used, they are used as blocks to kind of keep culture as it is, and almost to kind of, it's established this weird monoculture, I think, which is what I think so many people online have kind of railed against in the last few years. And so, you know, you see movements like Oscar So White, and you see you know, what people in the UK like Galdem are doing, and that, you know, that is to kind of remove those blocks from the from cultural gatekeepers, or to change cultural gatekeepers, or to offer a new cultural gatekeeper.
Could we hear a little bit from Rax's section?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to read. I'm going to read a bit from Rax's section. So Rakesh is grieving, and he's traveling the world doing stand-up, and all of the sections in his all of the chapters in his section are narrated by someone he meets while he is performing, rather than you kind of get a glimpse into who he is, for various stylistic choices, but mostly because I think so much of being a stand-up comedian is about external validation, and so I kind of wanted to write about a stand-up from the perspective of people who met the stand-up. So this chapter is called "All Cassavas Have the Same Skin, but Not All Taste the Same." And it's narrated by Rocky, and we're in New York. The first... I'm not going to do an American accent. just so we're clear. Wow, his American accent's terrible. It sounds like he's from London. The first time he comes in, he lectures me about our menu, telling me that calling it a chai tea latte is cultural misappropriation. I smile thinking he's joking, but then he launches into a whole spiel about it, and I'm like, dude, I just work here. You know chai tea latte is a redundant phrase, right? He says. He's from London. He might think that over here we're all going to be fawning over his accent, but no chance, buddy. No, this city is full of tight asses just like you. It's cultural misappropriation, he says. Chai means tea, right? So you're pretty much serving tea, like tea-flavoured tea. And anyway, seeing as you mean masala chai, not chai, so I guess a spiced tea. And you know that's made with mostly milk, right? Half milk, half water, probably. Or if you're feeling really luxurious, all milk all day. So having a masala chai latte is redundant because it's already made with milk. What are you going to do? Add milk to the tea-flavoured tea that's made with milk? Delicious. I can't help but smile at him committing to the bit, like he really wants to own this moment. And what can I get you, I ask. I'd like an Americano coffee, please, he says, laughing. Surely if it's American, you would just call it an American coffee, right? One Americano, I call out. Would you like it in or out? In, please. For here, I shout. Behind me, I can feel Maggie pretending I'm invisible again, so I call it out a second time. I fucking heard you, I hear her mutter. I take the payment and carry on serving. Serving's better than the alternative. If there's no customers, there's the code of the barista. If you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean. I watch this guy in the window and stare out. I watch this guy sit in the window and stare outside. He has brought a magazine, but he doesn't touch it. He's got his phone on the table, but he doesn't touch it. He goes into a deep stare with a crosswalk outside, watching the borough throb. The second time he comes in, he orders his Americano. He's quieter, less showy. Sorry for being an asshole yesterday, he tells me. I shake my head. I fed your feedback to the owner. Wait, can you feed feedback? I think you just feed back, he says. No, but I was feeding back your feedback. So you fed back to the owner that I had commented. Wait, no, you had feedback that I relayed. Yes, I relayed your feedback to the owner. And? He thinks you're an asshole, I say, laughing. That's fair. I think you're all right. Americano, or as the Americans might call it, coffee? Please, thank you. Can I have it to go? Sure, I say. No people watching today? He doesn't reply. A call comes through on his phone and he takes it, listening intently as he pays, juggling with phone, change and wallet, and goes to wait for Maggie, the slow ass, to pour him a fucking coffee. The next customer tries to give me his number. I decline it. He drops it into the tip jar anyway, winking at me. The third time he comes in, he asks if I want to get a cup of coffee sometime. Or, he says, maybe something different. You're probably sick of coffee, right? What about bows? I could really go for some bows. Do you like bows? Bows are fine, I say. I look around. Maggie's listening. This coffee shop has a strict no fraternisation policy. I think that's because some bigwig hotshot bullshit whatever's come here and they've said to the owner that people keep slipping them their scripts. I get off at 7, I say quietly. Noting my nod, he nods and mouths, 1:15 out front. I smile. I get asked out for a date every single day. Look, it's tough being Indian in the most hipster parts of this city. I remember a guy said namaste when I walked past a yoga studio, and I was like, guy, what the fuck? You just want to say hello to me? Say hello. Don't think you're being all spiritual. Fuck you. I was carrying a tiffin filled with my lunch, 4 layers, dal bhat shark rotli, and I think he thought, oh look, a Desi girl with a spiritual food carrier. How exotic and quaint. Fuck you, buddy. It keeps things separate. It's practical, and when I come home at night, it makes me feel safe to know I'm carrying steel with sharp edges. It's not exotic, it's daily life. My dad took one of these to work with him every single day. He told me once that a security guard searched it for a bomb. He worked at that same hospital for 30 years and they still treated him like a terrorist. I wore a kurti one day and someone said, oh, is it Diwali? And I was like, Mr. Mayonnaise, please, it's 90 degrees outside. You think I want to wear a t-shirt made of synthetic bullshit? Or do I want to wear breathable cotton and look at them first class? You tell me. But this British Desi guy, he seems okay. Plus he's right about the chai tea latte thing. I looked it up. I changed the menu that night after work. I changed it to masala chai. The owner didn't notice. Neither did Maggie. What name do you want on the cup? I ask. Rax, he replies. And he doesn't spell it because I should know. I pick up a cup and I write RAX on it. I had a winky face emoticon so he knows I'm joking. He smiles and the break of white through the unkempt beard and messy curly hair is a beacon of hope. 7:15, I mouth. He nods and walks along the line to collect his coffee. I nearly dance on the spot, but there's another customer waiting. She's staring at her phone and orders without paying attention. I give her the best customer service she'll ever have in her life, and she doesn't even know it.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to questions to the audience in a minute, but one thing...
Can I just say, I just remembered that you said there's a speaker outside. I'm really fucking sorry for swearing all the time. But Raki's got a filthy mouth.
That's okay. Most people passing are French. It's going to be... They won't understand, or if they do understand, they'll enjoy it. It's fine. I just want to talk, and that actually the extract you read sort of feeds very much into this, because I know, of course... I think it might even be in your essay in the Good Immigrant collection. You talk about chai and chai tea and this kind of sort of cultural misappropriation. And of course, as I said in the introduction, as you've talked about, before you were sort of writing politically about immigration and about race, you're first and foremost a fiction writer. And I'm just intrigued to hear you talk a little bit about after obviously having spent quite a lot of the last few years writing and talking about race and sort of writing non-fiction, what you see as the sort of what it feels like to sort of to come back to fiction and to talk about fiction, and also what you see as the value of being able to address some of the issues that interest and engage you in fiction rather than in articles or columns.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I'm not naturally a non-fiction writer, and I think some people have found it hard that I wrote this novel first and then my essay in The Good Immigrant, and I didn't know that this was going to be published, and so I lifted a couple of lines from that, as you heard, that, and it went into my essay in The Good Immigrant, and people are like, oh god, he's just run out of stuff to say. I'm like, no, I just have a finite number of things I want to say. But I find it a relief to be back in the world of fiction, because I think it's weird. I feel like fiction gives me more space to have more nuanced and complicated discussions with myself about the world, and with readers as well. I think for me, writing non-fiction is great, and it's done well for me. But the thing that I'm most fascinated with is people, and who people are when they present themselves in public, but who people are internally, and fiction gives me the space to really get into other people's minds, and do interesting things with themes. I don't just want to be lecturing people all the time, and I think fiction can give you the space to have quite complicated, nuanced discussions with people. And so, like my YA thriller, my YA book that's coming out next month is a thriller, but it's about gentrification and it's aimed at teenagers, and it discusses really complicated things around what gentrification does to communities, but also who is the complicity that we all feel at probably every level of society in gentrification without often acknowledging it or being sort of super conscious about it. And I don't think I could have written that as a non-fiction piece, but as fiction in the thriller setting, I can really do interesting things with it, and use like an exciting plot to introduce a theme or a subject to people that they might not have thought about, or they might have, it's interesting having been a youth worker for the last 4 years, like where young people are so much more progressively political than I am, and that's really, really exciting, but often they don't necessarily have the language to navigate it. So they'll be talking about these things and you'll go, oh, that's gentrification, and I'll go, oh, is there a word for it? And I'm like, yeah, and that's always really exciting to kind of like help young people on their journey. But went off topic there, but yeah, it's really nice to be writing fiction again. Fiction excites me personally as a writer more than non-fiction does.
Do you think, and maybe this is just going to be a speculative answer in a way, but do you think fiction has a capacity to reach more people than non-fiction, to have a greater impact, or is it just, do you think, strictly down to the writer and the particular piece in question?
I don't know, the numbers would dictate that non-fiction sells a lot better than fiction, right? So I guess the majority of people read like 2 or 3 books a year, and so often like a big non-fiction book that tries to discuss all of humanity, like Sapiens, or like Bill Bryson's A History of Everything. Those are kind of books that feel to people, or like, why I sort of find the thought of them quite unwieldy. I think to a lot of people they're like, oh, I can learn a history of everything in just one book.
Be quite efficient anyway.
Yeah. And then I'll be back from my holiday in Magaluf, and I'll be back to work, and the football season starts in 2 weeks.
There was one thing just before I hand over to the audience.
By the way, I'm not saying that people who watch football don't read books. Don't at me, by the way.
At the moment, in one of the sections, I think it's Neha. She talks about a half-remembered proverb that I think she heard from her childhood in Kenya, when she says, "Until the lion learns to speak, the tale of the hunt will glorify the hunter," and that really—that's
colonialism.
Yeah, but that really struck me as sort of a very sort of efficient encapsulation of what's sort of the force has been behind a lot of the movement, particularly over the last few years, and we've noticed this in the bookshop as well, for this kind of push for diversity in publishing and sort of finding a way to sort of bring more diverse voices to a sort of general audience. And the last thing I'd just like to talk to you very quickly about, and this is off topic of the one who wrote Destiny, but I know you've just launched the Good Agency, and I believe the Good Journal as well, which are both spin-offs of the Good Immigrant. I was just wondering if you'd just be able to talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah, sure. So after the Good Immigrant, I met lots of writers who said, if you're gonna do a follow-up, I'd love to contribute, or I would love to contribute to a follow-up, but I have no interest in writing about race and immigration. I write sci-fi, and I was meeting all these writers, and I thought, how can I platform these writers as well as the ones who are writing about all these issues? And so I thought, why don't I do a journal for like 4 issues to start, and just find lots of exciting writers and give them an opportunity to be published for the first time in a way that people will notice, because like we'd got lots of people to look at what we were doing with the Good Immigrant. So now the Good Journal, hopefully we announced like 12 writers who have never been published before, or have been published like 1 or 2 times before yesterday. But because it's this follow-up to the Good Immigrant, more people will be watching than if they won like a short story competition or what have you. So that's happening, and we're also because I have specific tastes, I thought I'm going to get some guest editors in who we're going to announce hopefully this week, as soon as the one for issue 4 says yes. And we also, a lot of these writers I was meeting weren't represented, and I was helping them find agents, and a bunch of them ended up with quite big book deals off the back of me introducing them to agents. And one of the things that I noticed, which was great, but one of the things I noticed with a lot of the writers who were coming to me and saying, can you help me find representation, was that I feel like a thing has been lost in UK publishing that is around patronising and nurturing writers in their infancy. Like, writers aren't automatically amazing. Writers have to work for years and years and years, and some writers might be able to afford the support of a creative writing masters from UEA or Bath Spa, but the majority of writers have writing groups that sit in cafes on a Sunday afternoon and like share work, and they support each other, but that might not help them to push them to where they need to be. And so one of the things I've been doing in my youth work is mentoring writers and spending lots and lots of time with them. So I thought, my agent and I thought, well, why don't we set up an agency where your job is to mentor writers, and we find an agent whose job it is to sell their work. So we just opened for submissions yesterday afternoon for the Good Literary Agency. I know a lot of agents are like, so are we bad agents? And I'm like, well, in a perfect world I'd just be writing and I wouldn't have to do this stuff, but there we go. In the words of Taylor Swift, look what you made me do. But within I can't remember what time did you come to the flat, at 6:30 today we'd had like nearly 60 submissions in just over 24 hours. A lot of those people definitely didn't read the submission guidelines, which are very clear, because they submitted way too quickly. But it just shows that there are people out there who just want help.
Yeah. If you have a question for Nikesh, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. The microphone is there. So we'll run it over to this young lady first.
It's quite a small room.
But we've got a podcast and video audience to think of.
Have I said anything inflammatory?
Don't worry, we can edit it out.
Sorry, thank you. Hi.
Hey.
So The Good Immigrant is one of my all-time favourite books ever since I've read it, and so I've been struggling with a question, and that I want to ask you. How do you make sure you don't have any prejudice or hatred toward white people? Because I always have this idea that I'm always on the defense, thinking how I always, you know what I mean? So I just have this question.
Oh God, that is how long have we got?
As long as you need.
As long as I need. I mean, I'm married to a white person, so I guess my work is less about. I feel like my work is less about, I guess, trying to create better white allies and more about empowering young people of colour to develop their voices. And so I almost don't need to deal with that, because I'm not interested in making nice for people or trying to present things in a way that might be more palatable. My concern is, do young people of colour feel the space to write unapologetically about what they want to write about, and that becomes my work. And so I just don't worry about it. I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer. I mean, some days I get irritated, like yesterday does everyone know what gammon is? So gammon is I've never eaten it, right? But it's like thick bacon, and it's sort of quite pink. Would you say it's like thick bacon? So there's been this thing going round where millennial white people on Twitter are calling right-wing old men gammons on Twitter for espousing right-wing hateful racist views. And there's been this huge debate in the last few days about whether white people calling other white people gammon is racist. And so to answer your question, you guys are on your own. Like, if that is the level of discourse, can a white person racially abuse another white person by comparing them to some thick bacon? That is the level of discourse in the UK. And it doesn't make me angry, it just makes me go, I am not interested in, like, your feelings. Like, I'm more interested in, like, working with young people of colour. So that kind of takes me out of the running for having to feel a way about it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Also, anyway, I was going to Karen talking about gammon.
Hi, I have a question about your what you said about fiction. You said that fiction allows you to have a conversation with yourself and think about issues. But when I listened to the first part of the first page of your book, the character seems to struggle with finding his own language. What is your concern with language? How do you position yourself with language?
Yeah, I've always had this sort of really how do I say it? It's an interesting question. It's a primary concern of mine. For years and years, I didn't know that there was this thing called code switching. I just sort of did it without really knowing what it was. But this sort of idea that I always thought that I just acted differently in different environments, and so when I was at my school, which was predominantly white people, I would be a version of myself, and when I was at home I would talk in a completely different language, and when I was with my friends I would talk in a completely different language, and I always thought I was just being different people with different in different situations. But it took me a while to realise that it's called code switching, where you're still yourself but you just know how to navigate different spaces, and we all do it. Like, we all do it to different degrees. I guess it's just more pronounced where you grow up in an environment where you don't necessarily speak English, or you speak the language of that country at home. And I didn't speak English at home, I spoke in Gujarati, and so and when I would go to India to speak with to meet, like, hang out with my cousins, they always spoke a version of English that always to me felt quite old-fashioned, but they always thought that the way that my family practiced Hinduism was quite old-fashioned. And it was about these time capsules of language and culture that had kind of migrated without ever updating itself or growing with the times. And so I'm really fascinated by how language, especially when you come from a background where you don't necessarily learn English, you don't speak English in the home, like what that does to your sense of self. And I grew up predominantly listening to rap, and if when I read my work aloud, it's subtle but it's there, but there's lots of rap rhythms in there because I'm interested in the cadence of that those rhythms, and so fiction allows me to be playful like that in a way that I'm just not a good enough non-fiction writer to be that playful yet.
There's one moment where Mukesh says language is important, it kills people, it hurts people, it colonizes people. And there's real, I think it's a thread that does run through the book, actually, is this sort of the importance and the power of language for damaging people, but also for enacting positive change as well. We have a young lady there. Oh, yeah.
Hi, thanks for being here.
Hi. Thank you for coming.
This is more of a comment than a question.
Oh.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
Go home.
Just kidding. I was really fascinated by the comments that you made, or the storyline around the intergenerational or generational views of racism, and it made me wonder, where do you hope kind of the next generation to be? What would that look like to you?
Yeah. So, when people say, I don't really see colour, I just treat everyone the same. And while I understand the intent, why I understand why someone might say that and think that it's a good thing. It's actually a form of erasure. What I see in young people who I've been working with for the last 4 years, maybe it's just the type of young person who's been attracted to the type of work or the project that I was running, but like their ability to talk fluidly about politics and issues that are important to them without having to signpost identities, I think is really, really amazing, in a way that, like, when you think about how conversations around identity politics get really mired in the idea of having to talk about identity politics. I feel like the next generation has moved a step beyond that, where it's so natural to walk into a space where, like, the first thing everyone does is just say what pronouns they use, and it's not a big deal, or like it's like no one feels a way about it. It's just the way it is, and I see small changes like that, and I'm like, I have hope for the future, because like young people are able to have those conversations, or like are able to move beyond the very nature of having to talk about identity, because like they're able to fluidly discuss things from a perspective that is so in tune with what their identities are, whereas I think it just naturally comes out for me, it unnaturally comes out for me, because I'm in that sort of middle generation where I'm still communicating with my elders and trying to have progressive conversations with people who are younger than me, and so sort of stuck in the middle.
I think that is all we've got time for, at least for the kind of the formal conversational part of the evening. As always, we will be serving wine afterwards, so do stick around, continue the conversation with Nikesh, with each other. I mean, this is the moment where I was going to do the hard sell, but I don't think I really need to, because I think after this last hour you're all going to rush to the till and buy the book anyway. But I will tell you, just to stress that in addition to The One Who Wrote Destiny, we also have Nikesh's previous books, as well as copies of The Good Immigrant, of course. So if the hard sell is necessary, I would say go home with 3 or 4 books rather than just the one. Otherwise, I'm sure Nikesh will be very happy to sign any books that you buy. All that remains for me to say is please join me one more time in giving it up for Nikesh Shukla.